Now, for more on this, joining me in studio is Arwa Damon, and she's the president and founder of INARA. It's a non-profit that provides access to life-altering medical and mental health care to children impacted by human-induced or natural disasters. Arwa, thank you so much for joining us in studio. You've been to Syria since the fall of the regime. You have teams there. You've seen the aftermath of this. There's so much hope, there's so much joy, but there's also so much pain that needs to be dealt with. What are you and your team seeing there?
There really is. There's so much hurt, and it's a very deep, profound hurt that is still very much present. I remember I was in a neighborhood called Daraya, and this is where INARA actually started some of its first activities, setting up sort of a safe play space for children who can also work on their mental health. And as I was there speaking to the kids, but also to the mothers, you know, Daraya alone has roughly 15,000 of its husbands and sons who have been disappeared. And before the fall of the Assad regime, mothers, when the kids asked, "Where's daddy?" used to say, "Well, daddy's with the regime." Now the kids are coming back and saying, "But mama, the regime is gone, so why isn't daddy home yet?" And mothers don't know how to explain to their children that daddy disappeared, that daddy was, you know, tortured in prison, that daddy may have died in prison, that daddy was one of these numbers, that daddy is in an unmarked grave somewhere. And that is a huge obstacle that they are going to need to overcome. And you also have this other dynamic where so many kids, I mean, and I just remember being so struck by this in Daraya, where the head of the organization that gave us the space to set up and was saying, look, these kids have never had a space like this. They don't know what it's like to run on a soft surface. And then you really begin to realize what all of this multiple displacement means. So many children don't know what it's like to sleep in a bed. They don't know what it's like to take a hot shower. Their showers are with buckets of cold water. They don't know what it's like to have that feeling of knowing that their next meal is guaranteed. And I remember years ago, because I used to be a senior correspondent at CNN and I covered Syria very extensively, I was in Idlib and I met a girl who had lost her leg in an explosion. And I remember then asking her, you know, well, what do you dream of for the future? What are your hopes? And her face was completely blank when she looked at me. And I said, do you dream about a life without war? And she said, no. These children, up until this point, did not know what a life without war actually looks like.
Now they're living, though, in a life without war. But there are so many challenges. We outlined how many children need help and they need support. Your organization does that type of work. But what are the immediate needs now, especially for children, as the new government also tries to shore up its resources, try to provide these basic facilities for their people, but it is going to take some time.
It is going to take time, and that is very much, you know, to be expected. What children need is what I call sort of pillars of stability. So a safe home, education, family, community, and all of this in Syria needs to be rebuilt. Children need everything from warm clothing to notebooks and pens. A lot of the schools that we visited, the communities that we were talking to were saying this is what they need. And then also you have Syria's medical infrastructure that was very heavily decimated. And I'm talking about from, you know, centers that can provide the basic primary health care to those that can actually carry out complex surgeries. Another aspect that we focus on is children who need these complex surgeries due to war or other injuries. And we actually, because we traveled all over the country from Damascus to Homs to Aleppo, we just got the list from Homs of children who were injured in the war years and years ago, who never got the surgery that they need. There's over 100 names on that, and that's just what this one organization was able to provide us with. So there are many steps that need to actually start to happen for Syria to really be able to come together, and also on a grander scale than that, decide what its identity is going to be. Because no one wants the identity that Syria had over the last 50 plus years. But how do you create an identity moving forward, ensuring that no one is left behind and that these physical and psychological scars are adequately dealt with? Because it's not about erasing the past, especially when we talk about psychological scars. It's about teaching a child and an adult how to be able to move forward with the pain.
This is something I wanted to ask, because it's not just children who are going through this. Syria has so much generational trauma, generational pain for almost 50 years under the Assad regime. You have the Syrian diaspora, many who have chosen now to come back, but they're coming back to very different lives from what they left, and they're also having to deal with not maybe having access to the basics. And when it comes to adults, and you wrote this on your X account, you said the traumas across the country are deep, raw wounds. How do adults, and I want to look at particularly women, you spoke about a woman whose husbands had been disappeared under the regime. They're not just the mothers, they're the fathers, as you wrote in on X. How did they even start to deal with what they are going through and then still trying to be parents to their children?
It takes an extraordinary, almost awe-inspiring level of strength, because they have to bury all of their own pain because they want to protect their children. And they are the only remaining parent, and they do have to be mother and father. And so they have to be this pillar of stability and strength for their children. So one of the other programs that we're starting to get established also is going to help the mothers. But obviously the work is enormous, because you have the pain of the loss of your husband, the pain of having to raise your child, the pain of all of the unanswered questions, especially if your husband is someone who disappeared. And then you also have the uncertainty of the future, because even though, yes, there is a lot of hope right now, there's a lot that is uncertain, and the bare basics haven't changed. The challenge of putting food on the table hasn't changed. Prices have gone down because the Assad regime is no longer taxing items, but everything is still extremely expensive. And so the psychological burden that is specifically on mothers is extraordinary.
It really is. I'm wondering, for you who has covered Syria for such a long time, you have such close ties obviously to the country. Now that the regime has fallen, you have an interim government in place. What are your hopes for the future?
I mean, look, obviously my key and central hope would be that, Syria ends up being the country that Syrians want, that Syrians themselves can be proud of, the country that they fought so hard for, the country that, more than 500,000 people died for, more than 150 million people were forcibly disappeared for. I actually ran into a couple of fairly prominent Syrian female political activists when I was just in Damascus. And they pointed out something, and they said, look, there's a lot of criticism right now. There's a lot of people that are kind of quite disparaging when it comes to what's happening in Syria, but we have to hold on to optimism. We have to keep believing that the Syria that we want is something that we will eventually actually have. And for me on a personal level, it was deeply emotional, because obviously I covered it a lot, and I ended up being blacklisted by the Assad regime because of some of my coverage of what was happening. And my mother is Syrian, and so you're going through Damascus, and you're going through Homs, and you're going through Aleppo, and it's just this mental Rolodex of the courage and the bravery that I saw over all of those years, but also the faces of everyone who died or who disappeared. And so it was very much like kind of being in a pinball machine, going through, hope and joy, but then sorrow and hurt. And
a multitude of emotions,
yes.
I'm sure, but hopefully those who gave their lives for a better future their generations will see it. Thank you so much, Arwa Damon, for coming in. Really appreciate it.